Alrighty, we are back from our break. We have a next exciting speaker, Tim Beiko from the Ethereum Foundation, and he'll be talking to us about real-world tolerance. 次のスピーカーはティム・ベイコーさんです。彼は Real World Tolerance について話してくださります。はい、お願いします。So, let's go. Floor is yours, Tim.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Hopefully. I'll just get started, and if there's an issue, just let me know. But yeah, thanks for the introduction. My name is Tim Beiko, and yeah, the title of my talk today is Real World Tolerance. Before I get started, just a couple disclaimers. First, this is my personal opinion, so this is not a talk that's the Ethereum Foundation's opinion or all of Core Devs, or obviously not all of Ethereum. Also, I'm not a geopolitical expert, so some of the things in this talk might be a bit vague or not quite right on the details, but hopefully the high-level idea is interesting. And then on by saying there's still a lot of uncertainty in all this. So if you have any comments or corrections, please send them my way. I would love to chat. So let's get into it. So real-world tolerance. A thing that we talked about a lot in the Ethereum space is this idea of real-world adoption. We want Ethereum to be used broadly across the world. And my premise for this talk is that this is obviously something we should do, but it's only necessary and not necessarily sufficient for Ethereum to be successful in the long term. And the reason for this is that Ethereum has a lot of properties that are fundamentally in tension with existing power structures in the world. Ether, the asset, is effectively sovereign money that the protocol issues. Ethereum enables permissionless coordination. You can start a DAO. It doesn't have to be set up as a legal entity or to exist in any specific jurisdiction. And obviously, when we talk about censorship resistance, it always assume there is some power there that wants to censor some user. And obviously, those powerful actors have a reason why they'd want to do that. And so, given all of this, one question that we should ask ourselves is, why should existing power structures tolerate Ethereum to exist as is? And usually, when we think about this, there's a couple sort of answers that come up. The first is that maybe they won't and will fight back, so we designed the Ethereum protocol to be resistant to this. Sometimes people talk about designing Ethereum to be World War III resistant. That's effectively what they meant by this. I think there's another sort of outcome where maybe from existing nation states perspective, Ethereum just becomes somewhat irrelevant, where you look at something like the Pirate Bay, for example, today, torrenting still exists. It's still a thing that people can do. But by and large, things like Netflix, Spotify, or Kindle ebooks have taken the majority of the market. So torrenting is just not this really relevant thing in the world as it was originally thought it would be. And then another failure mode is something that was coined a few years ago called Bitcoin TM. There's a great post by Epsilon Theory about this, where in the Bitcoin context, people talk a lot about institutional adoption and wanting to have everyone in the world own Bitcoin. But one way this can happen is if it's facilitated through the existing financial system. I'm sure you can get everyone to own Bitcoin, but they're not actually owning Bitcoin in a self-custodial way or sending it to each other peer-to-peer. Everyone effectively owns the coins through an ETF or something like that. And this is effectively a vector for capture where you might have achieved your originally stated goal, but you've done so by compromising on the core properties of the protocol. And so all of these are pretty bleak outcomes. And one thing I've been trying to think about is other more positive versions of this. And one idea that I want to talk about is what would it look like for Ethereum to provide some value to the world, such that it's the only place or the only protocol in the world that can provide this and get tolerated that way. And so my thesis for this talk is that, in short, if we want existing nation states and other power structures to tolerate Ethereum's properties at scale, we need to have something called an absolute competitive advantage at creating some valuable export for the world. So a bit of background here. In terms of just like competitive dynamics in the market. There's effectively 4 positions you can be in the market where either you're like at a comparative disadvantage with other producers where, you know, other people are just better than you at producing something, so it makes sense for you to buy it from them. You can be in a state where you have competitive parity, so you're effectively as good as another producer for something, and you're kind of ambivalent between either buying the good from them or producing it yourself. Then comparative advantage, you know, you're better than the other people at producing X, so people buy it from you. And the strongest competitive position you can be in is having an absolute advantage, where either you're the only one who can produce something, or you're the only one who can do it in like a cost-effective way, and so you effectively have, you know, like a complete advantage over everyone else in the world at this stage. And one principle related to this is that in practice, outside of crypto, we see that nation states will often tolerate pretty big ideological or political differences with other trading partners if their economic exports are valuable enough. And this is what I'm talking about when I talk about real world tolerance is, you know, they don't necessarily have to agree with everything, but they'll tolerate this because they get, you know, positive value out of it. And one note on this before I move on, Ethereum is obviously not a country, you know, it's not like a physical place with borders and has to deal with food and shelter for its citizens. But I think it's still valuable to think of it as like a strong economic force in the world, at least for the purpose of the stock. And so if we look in the real world at some examples of like comparative and absolute advantages, you can sort of start from like, you know, some weaker ones and building your way up to the strongest ones. One of the, you know, biggest ones is just oil production. So Saudi Arabia and Russia specifically have about 20% of worldwide oil production, which is roughly on par with the US. And, you know, I think you can see how this gives them pretty strong geopolitical leverage across a bunch of topics where, you know, they have very different values than a lot of their trading partners, but then these partners will engage in trade with them because of this. And, you know, one that's a bit stronger is the case of cobalt in Congo. So Congo has about 70% of the world's production of cobalt, which is used to power a bunch of different electronics that effectively everyone relies on. And again, this gives them like strong geopolitical leverage. You know, things like human rights and whatnot are things where they get sort of a more lenient treatment than others because they have this like pretty valuable resource. I think today, probably the most salient example of like an absolute advantage in the world is TSMC, the Taiwan chip manufacturer, where, you know, it produces over 90% of the world's most advanced chips and something like 70% of worldwide chips last time I checked. And this is just, you know, effectively like this huge advantage where, you know, most modern computers effectively can't run without chips that are produced by TSMC. And it gives sort of the entire country this huge geopolitical weight that it otherwise might not have. And so when we think about Ethereum, one thing I think we should consider is like when we're thinking about what should we be building, what are the things that like we should be spending our time and efforts on, it's worth thinking whether these are things that can help us build towards a strong competitive advantage. And like a very short version of this is like what would it look like to build something like Ethereum's TSMC? One example, you know, that people have used in the past is the idea of banking the unbanked, where Ethereum effectively allows anybody to create an Ethereum address, and through this they can interact with all of the network and, you know, all of DeFi and whatnot, and they don't need to sort of have a customer relationship with a traditional financial institution. So this means that a lot of people who, you know, might not be able to get that are users that are like easier for Ethereum to reach. And, you know, one comparative advantage you have there, you know, from the perspective of just aligning with existing power structures is things like exporting US dollars, you know, in other places in the world because we have something like USDC on Ethereum or USDT. And you can see how this is a bit of a like precarious position to be in where, you know, while this might be something that allows like these power structures to tolerate Ethereum more than they otherwise would, if it shifted overnight, if there was an easier way to reach those people, or if it turns out they didn't have this as a strategic goal, this wouldn't be a super strong advantage for Ethereum. So it's like a useful thing to think of as like a tactical stepping stone, but it might not be like the core thing you want to build your competitive advantage around. One other thing that Ethereum is unique for that I think is a bit stronger and might be a good candidate for an absolute advantage is this idea of Ethereum being an economic testnet for the world. And what I mean there is that Ethereum is big enough in terms of like the economic value that it secures and generates that we can actually run pretty big experiments on it. We can run things at tens, hundreds of millions of dollars in scale, if not billions. And we do this in a way where we can be more risk-taking than existing institutions who like manage similar amounts of capital because Ethereum is pretty disconnected from the rest of the world. Again, Ethereum is not like a real country. It doesn't have to deal with like, citizens, food and shelter. And so it can afford to be more risk-taking. And what this means is that we can effectively look at all the potential new ideas around mechanism designs or economics or whatnot, and actually test them and iterate on them and prove which ones work and under which conditions they work. And this is something we can export back and, go back to the world and say, hey, we tried, quadratic funding and retroactive public goods funding. And, if you set it up this way and this way and this way, in those contexts, you can actually allocate, hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars in this way. And this is something that I don't think there are really other places in the world that, you can do this. So it's a bit closer to an absolute advantage. And maybe the one caveat is that it sort of implies we have to keep coming up with these things over and over. Where like if we just do one of these and export it, then it doesn't give us much lasting power. So to recap everything so far, Ethereum has these core properties that are in tension with existing power structures. Getting adopted at scale doesn't mean we get to be tolerated at scale and won't get pushback. And there's a bunch of ways you can be defensive about this, but one way to be more proactive and to improve our long-term odds is to think about exports or things we can bring to the world where Ethereum has like a very strong comparative advantage and ideally an absolute advantage where it's the only thing in the world that's able to produce this new thing. So what if we can't do this? Maybe we just don't have enough weight or enough, resources alone to be like this like effectively economic actor that's tolerated by existing network states. The way that people resolve this again in the real world is through coalitions, right? Like you find allies that can help sort of build a sort of coalition with you. And the question is, what should Ethereum's coalition be? Like, what is the thing, if we were to do this, that we want to build a coalition around? And a few ideas I think are worth considering from a bunch of different posts over the past few years to help think about this are, first, Vitalik's idea around DIAC. So he had this post around DevConnect last year in Istanbul, talking about the EAC movement and what he saw as like a potential response for that. And the idea of DIAC was the Ethereum community should focus on building technology that's like optimized for defenders rather than attackers, that helps push the ideals of democracy forward, and that pushes decentralization rather than relying on like centralized third parties to secure things. Another really good article to help us think about this is an article by Josh Stark around what Ethereum's core value proposition is. The piece is called Atoms, Institutions, and Blockchains. And what he claims there is that the thing Ethereum gives us in the world is this property called hardness, which is the ability to make claims or commitments about the future that are credible and make an uncertain future more predictable. And his thesis is that, there's other things like this in the world. There's specific materials, which he calls atoms, that do this. If you think of something like gold, we can know that there's this much gold in the world. And so we can, make all these assumptions around it and, use it for things like storing value and other use cases as well. But that's kind of hard because we have to rely kind of on nature's randomness. So we have this other thing, institutions, where, if we want to make credible commitments beyond a single individual, we can set up institutions, and then we can effectively rely on them, to make the future predictable on a longer time scale, and with less of a like variable risk than you would by relying on a specific individual. But institutions are quite heavyweight. They don't always work well and whatnot. And blockchains are effectively a new way that we can create hardness in the world, where we have this digital thing where we can just say, here's a smart contract, and it does X, Y, and Z, and you know that under these economic conditions and these security assumptions, it will do this thing in the future as you expect it to. And that's effectively this idea of hardness. And then the last piece I want to highlight is a recent piece by Vitalik again around political alliances. And specifically commenting on all of the support of crypto tokens recently, where he argues that the thing we should actually be looking for in these alliances isn't as much support of the crypto tokens, but support of these other values that are very central to Ethereum and to the crypto space as a whole. So things around freedom, things around privacy and whatnot. And that's a stronger basis on which to build these alliances, rather than just saying, support Ethereum. And so, putting all this together, we have these three ideas: DAC, defense, democracy, decentralization, favoring tech; hardness, this ability to create future certainty; and then these crypto values that we've mentioned at the very beginning. So, freedom, permissionlessness, neutrality, censorship resistance. Then I think this gives us a good basis to think about what do we want to build coalitions around. And I was talking about this in the past couple months with someone I work with, Venkatesh Rao, and he came up with this phrase, so hardening the commons, as basically the unifying principle around which you could build these coalitions, saying that one good way to think of Ethereum's impact in the world isn't necessarily as this token, or isn't necessarily as this tech platform, but can we have this infrastructure that exists on chain to help commons make these hard commitments where they can't rely on existing institutions for whatever reason. And I think this is a really good candidate to think about what's the framing we want to have if we are to build these coalitions with other sort of economic and political actors in the world. And so to wrap all of this up, I'll just summarize everything we went through. But as I said earlier, Ethereum has these core power structures that are in tensions with existing power structures. Sorry, Ethereum has core properties that are in tension with these power structures, things like censorship resistance, things like having a sovereign money and whatnot. And so if Ethereum gets adopted at scale, it doesn't mean that it will be tolerated. There's a lot of worlds in which we have a much more adversarial relationship with these powers. And that's ideally something we should avoid. And I think one way we can avoid this is by effectively coming up with things that are uniquely valuable to the world, where only Ethereum is able to produce those things. And if we're not able to do this, then we should think about, okay, what are other coalitions that we want to build, and people and institutions we want to align ourselves with. And to do this, thinking of Ethereum as a tool to harden the commons is probably a more productive framing than thinking of Ethereum as just another crypto project. And so the question I'll wrap up with is sort of an exercise to the reader. What is Ethereum's absolute advantage in hardening the commons? And yeah, that's what I had. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Tim. That was a great presentation. Yes, Tim is here. If anyone has maybe, are you, Tim, okay if there's a question or two? Okay.
I can do a question or two, yeah.
All right. We have time for maybe one or two questions if anyone has. Any questions? All right, it looks like everyone's still needing a little bit for warm-up still today. So, but that was awesome. Thanks so much, Tim. Pleasure having you.
Of course. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.